Now it is recording. Huh? It's just cancel. Is
that what?
Yeah.
Hello? So I guess people have got it.
Check. Let's see here. Good morning. It's 7:49 a.m. Test record. Saturday, April 29th.
Hi, how are you? I'm Allison. Yes, thank you so much. Oh my gosh, no, thank you for everything and for sending your slides and for agreeing to contribute. It's really appreciated. Thank you. Does anybody else want to check the
Good morning, everybody. We're not getting started yet, but if everybody could kindly stand up and shift over so we can make some more room for people. We're working on getting some more seats in here. We've still got several minutes to start. We all love each other very much. Let's get close. Okay.
It's so quiet in here, but we still have a few minutes before we're going to get started, so feel free to talk amongst yourselves. Good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for attending our symposium this morning, titled Motivation Theory, Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow, Reflections of Founders and Descendants. It is wonderful and incredible to see so many people here this morning. My name is Allison Kowenka, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at The Ohio State University, and as co-chair of this symposium, I'm going to briefly introduce you to it, and then provide just some perspective or situate you to our overarching objectives. So in large part, thanks to so many researchers here today, research focusing on questions related to motivation in education has endured tremendous growth over the past 50 or so years, which has offered much insight into critical questions, including, but certainly not limited to, what motivational processes ultimately predict academic success, for whom and under what circumstances. Several theoretical frameworks have guided a great deal of this research, including attribution theory, expectancy value theory, social cognitive theory, self-determination theory, and achievement goal theory. And partially due to the growth of these models in recent decades, and also recent substantive and methodological advances in the empirical literature, there are important questions about the next steps for each theoretical model. Some of these questions have persisted across time. For example, how can theoretical constructs in a given model be defined? And how do these constructs within different models relate to each other? Whereas other questions have become much more salient in recent years. For example, how can a given theoretical model or a set of theoretical models explain student motivation across unique cultures? So So as a result, the timing is arguably perfect for a symposium that brings researchers from each of these theoretical traditions together for a stimulating and interactive discussion. So, to this end, and inspired by the tremendous growth of these models, coupled with empirical advances in the recent years in the literature, we hope that this symposium will bring together leading researchers who either founded these theoretical models or have considerably contributed to their development to first present their views on history, current status, and future directions, and also to provide an opportunity for these theorists to engage with each other and members of the audience to discuss pressing issues and motivation to be addressed in future work. It is both a delight and a true honor to have so many esteemed researchers here today to take part in this symposium. In particular, Dr. Bernard Weiner will share his insight and recommendations on attribution theory. Drs. Jackie Eccles and Chris Hulleman will do so for expectancy value theory. Dr. Dale Shunk for social cognitive theory, Dr. Edward Deasy for self-determination theory, and Dr. Tim Erden for achievement goal theory. Dr. Sandra Graham will serve as moderator of the discussion. And finally, Dr. Alan Wakefield regrettably is unable to be here this morning due to extenuating circumstances, and as a result, I wanted to both recognize and thank him for his vision and leadership in conceptualizing and developing this symposium. And last, here's a brief overview of how we've structured the session. We'll first hear from each panelist, where they will briefly discuss their perspective on their respective theories' history and recommended next steps. Then Dr. Graham will raise some questions for the panelists. Dr. Graham will next invite questions from the audience and raise questions from individuals that were submitted ahead of time. And then finally, we'll hear some brief closing remarks from each panelist. So I will end there, and without further ado, I am delighted to invite Dr. Weiner to share his reflections and his recommendations on attribution theory.
If you have any recommendations, I'm going to talk about history a little bit. Thanks for coming so early in the morning. My goodness, I really appreciate it. I'm going to talk about a slice in time in the history of attribution theory, starting about 1955 and going till about 1975. So a little slice of where it all started. And the person's picture up there is where it starts with Fritz Heider. Of course, he had predecessors also. But current attribution theory, as we talk about it, certainly is attributed to Heider. I have another picture of Heider. Let me see. Yeah, that's a better picture. I like that one. I think he was about the same age then that I was now. Heider was born in Graz and went to the University of Graz in Austria, got his PhD there. And then he went to Germany, to Humboldt University, just on the border, what used to be East Berlin. And the Gestaltists were there, Wertheimer, Kafka, and Kohler. And also Kurt Lewin was there at Humboldt University. Heider and Lewin formed a very close friendship, and when they were in America, spent their summers together. In the late 1920s, Kurt Kafka, one of the Gestaltists, came to the United States. He accepted a research fellowship at Smith College, where Jackie also started, which you may remember. And he wanted another assistant, and so he wrote to Germany, and Heider accepted that assistantship offer. So Heider then came to Smith College in 1930. Kafka's fellowship was at the School for the Deaf at Smith College. Heider joined his research group, and among the other members of the group was Grace Moore. Grace Moore was at Smith because her sister was deaf, and she soon became Grace Moore Heider, and that's how it happened that Fritz Heider stayed in the United States. I have one story. Fritz was wasn't shy. He was very quiet, very introverted, very self-contained. Spoke with a very heavy accent. And when he came to Smith, he was interviewed by one of the professors for the assistantship at Smith also. And she was a very loquacious, very talkative woman. You couldn't get a word in edgewise with her. So at the end of the interview, she went to the chair and she said, "Well, I didn't realize he had a speech impediment." Anyway, he stayed. He stayed at Smith. There's an interesting sidelight of Fritz's own development. So there's a film you may or may not know, Heider and Simmel. Does that strike a bell? That's Kafka, a little behind. There's the film, it's a Heider and Simmel film, and in this film objects dance around the screen, and you tend to see or perceive or believe there are people chasing one another, and there's aggression and love triangles. And Heider used this film to illustrate the similarity of the laws of object perception and person perception. But he developed the film along with a lot of other material he was developing for his deaf population. It was a very interesting illustration of how the scientific community and the environment in which you're in shapes and determines in part your science. Anyway, this is Heider at Smith. He stayed until 1947. He published very little. He was not interested very much in publishing, a little bit, but he tended to be very disorganized, had thousands of little notes, pieces of paper. And in 1947, Roger Barker, who is a Gestaltist who studied with Kurt Levine, Roger Barker went to the University of Kansas and became chairperson at the University of Kansas. And he then brought a number of Gestaltists to Kansas, one of whom was Heider, where Heider finally got promoted to full professor. At Kansas, then Heider published a book, Psychology of Interpersonal Relations. It was with the help of Beatrice Wright. Heider wasn't organized enough to put it together, but Beatrice Wright helped a lot. She's still alive. She's 97, 98 or something, still in good shape. Still at the university. No, she went to Indiana. Anyway, the book contained two theories that dramatically changed the field of psychology. 5. You gotta be kidding, I'm just starting. She's not even on the panel. I mean, so the book contained two major theories that really changed psychology in the next few decades: balance theory and attribution theory. Balance theory immediately caught hold, in part because of Leon Festinger, and dissonance theory was a balance theory. Festinger didn't cite Heider and didn't perceive himself as a follower of Heider. But the other social psychologists who had balance theories, Newcomb, Cartwright, certainly recognized the influence of Heider. And the second attribution theory didn't really take hold. I remember at that time I was in a seminar with my mentor, Jack Atkinson, and we read it and we just dismissed it right away. Well, that's not science. I mean, that's just, my God. Out to Darwin Heider, and I was a student out to Darwin Heider. There was a belief that balance theory was kind of non-common sense and attribution theory was merely naive psychology and common sense. But in fact, the methodology to develop the two theories was identical, and it's an incorrect characterization. So when Hunter developed balance theory, he would use what was called thought experiments. He'd say, 2 o'clock I'm going to do some research, and he'd walk up to his study, and he'd think, and the balance thoughts were, let's see, and this is really true, this is how balance started. What if Romeo's parents liked Juliet? What would have happened? What if Romeo didn't love Juliet? What would have happened? And he said they're putting pluses and minuses and minuses and pluses, and that was the origin of balance theory. It was entirely naive psychology, as naive as attribution theory. So anyway, that was attribution theory, and it didn't take hold. And in 1960, Hal Kelly wrote a review for contemporary psychology. And in those days, contemporary psychology was very meaningful. Writing a review there, everyone read it. And Kelly was a very respected psychologist, and he wrote this very favorable review. And then he followed that up with his own work in 1967, the Kelly Cube. And that really brought attention to attribution theory. Picture of Kelly somewhere here. That's Kelly on the right with a couple of his friends. That's Kelly on the right. So Kelly brought attention to attribution theory. Then when I entered this picture, Kelly came to me and said he was going on sabbatical. Could I take over for one of his students? And I said, sure. I didn't know what she was doing. She came to me, I said, what do you want to do? She said, well, I want to study why people think they succeeded or failed. I said, oh God, I hate that. That's that attribution of haters. No way I'm going to chair that. But I had to. I didn't have tenure, and Kelly was, Kelly. Then about a year later, somewhere in 1969, Kelly came to me again and said, let's form a seminar in attribution theory, and we'll invite 6 people. And, I was flattered that he asked me. And he asked then Ned Jones, Edward Jones, who was as well known and as influential as Kelly at that time. And 4 others, Dick Nesbitt, and myself, Stu Amos, Dave Knauss. We met for 3 weeks at UCLA. We met every morning for 3 hours, then went away. And at the end of those 3 weeks, I'll just finish this story and then I'll let it go. I'll leave. I just won't talk about all of this stuff. That's okay. It's not your fault. So we met every morning for 3 weeks, and then we disbanded for a year, and we all had a task, which was to write a paper. And then we were to give that paper to 2 others in the group, to reviewers or critics. We met again a year later at Yale. First meeting was UCLA, second meeting was at Yale, again for 3 weeks with our completed work. So my 2 reviewers, unfortunately, were Kelly and Jones. They were the 2 smartest, most verbal, most critical people. I said, oh my God, there goes my tenure, I'm dead. So I worked like a madman, and I sent the paper out, before our meeting at Yale. And about 10 hours later, I got a response from Jones. He was like that. I'm not listening to him. Just one moment. I got a response from Jones. And Jones says, Bernie, he said, this needs a lot of work. He said, don't send it to Kelly. He'll kill you. He said, there's way too much theory. It's way too long. You need control groups. You need experiments. You need data. My God, he was just blasted. I figured, well, okay, it's Jones, he must be right. So I revised it, because Kelly, just the opposite of Jones, was always late. I figured, he's never going to read it, he's going to read it 6 months later. So I'm working like mad, new experiments, new control groups, new everything. I figured I'll get it to Kelly before he sees the first draft. And just almost a week before I'm ready to get it out, there's an envelope from Kelly. I said, oh my God, and I read it, it said, Bernie, don't send this to Jones, it needs a lot of work. There's not enough theory. There's not enough theory, there's too many experiments, there's too much data. You don't need all those controls. So I changed about 5 words of the original manuscript. I sent it back to each of them, and they said it's much better. That's all we have time for, sorry.
Thank you so much, Dr. Weiner, and I take full responsibility for having to cut you short. Okay, so now we have Dr. Eccles.
Well, you all may not know this, but I was Bernie's student at that time. I went to UCLA in 1968 and started working in developmental and thought I was going to die. And Bernie was there and someone said, Irene Free says, come into our lab, come into our lab. And I said, okay. And that changed my life too. So you've heard the history. I share that same theoretical history and intellectual history. And I have even less time because I'm sharing my time with Chris, so he can take us forward in time. So the one thing I want you to note is if you do expectancy value theory, you have to have blonde hair and you have to wear it in a that's our first criteria. We check it off. All right. So, I began my work with a very specific question. Why aren't females less likely to go into math and physical science than males? That wasn't really my question, but that was a question that the then NIE put forward. And I thought, oh, I can relate to that question. It brought together a lot of the things that I was interested in, motivation, gender theory, and other things. And so I said, I'll take on that challenge. And with a group of students at Michigan, we actually then set out to try to come up with a proposal. And what we did was to first step back and say, what is that question an example of? What is the bigger issue? And of course it was clear to us the bigger issue is why does anybody do anything? And so we wanted to then look at the psychological and biological and social forces that would influence the critical choices people make about how to spend their time in their lives. So we really came at this as trying to come up with a comprehensive theory that had both psychological and social components. So essentially, because of the time, I was very much involved in feminist theory. I was very much involved in the cultural revolutions that were going on at that time. So I sort of was bordering psychology and sociology all of my career. We wanted to come up with a theory that actually respected both the person and the environment that they were in. And so we very much wanted a theory that would recognize personal agency, because that was part of the cognitive revolution that was going on at that time, against Skinner and others, that people actually play a role in their own development. But yet they do this within a social system. And so we wanted a theoretical framework that would think about the opportunities and barriers that would impinge on a person's ability to pick their own path. So from that came our model. And Bernie has always told me this is just much too complicated. We had a lot of theory too. So one of the things I want to point out is that when people talk about our theory, they often talk about those things that are in the yellow boxes. So they talk about the psychological piece of it. Now that was only part of the theory. So the theory, in fact, was much bigger than that. What were our contributions? Expectancy value is a classic theory. We did not invent expectancy value theory. Lewin talked about it. I learned about it from Bernie. It's been around for probably at least 150 years. And if you go back, I'm sure Aristotle talked about it too. Basically, it's pretty simple-minded. What's going to get somebody to do something? Because they think they can and they want to. That's pretty simple. So what we did was to actually build up this box called subjective task value. So interestingly, historically, Atkinson had eliminated it by saying it was 1 minus the probability of success. And so people stopped looking at the value, or at least psychologists stopped looking at the value box. And what we did was to put it back in, and it was very, I know, 2 minutes, okay, very salient, because we're trying to think about gender. So it really came in because we were interested in identities and roles, and how did you get those into this model? And they come into this model very much through values. But I want to talk about two particular, so what is a subjective task value according to us? So this is interesting given the debates now, and Chris will talk more about this. We thought of it as an emergent property of the tasks being considered. So it didn't reside in the person, it resided in their perception of the opportunities in their world. We specifically and purposefully did not specify the relative importance of the potential subcomponents of subjective task value. We just said these are the components that are likely to influence whatever this emergent property is. And we didn't because we thought, in fact, that would vary by person, it would vary by situation, it would vary by age, and it would vary by the purpose of the person making the decision at the particular point in time. So we left that undefined, and if I had to say where we should go now, I say that's a big question. How could we define that? What is the right way to think about how they interact? And what are the right moderating factors that would in fact lead to that? But within that set, we were particularly interested in two things that we added. We will take credit for this. One was attainment value, and this really came out of our feeling that identities were important, gender roles were important, and so we put this notion in of, look, the extent to which a task was related to a person's identity would give it value. If in fact it denied their identity, if it showed they weren't that kind of person, that would lead to a cost. The other thing that we added that we thought was very important was cost, and Chris is going to say more about that, but just to give you a few things, we thought there were psychological costs, we thought there were financial and physical costs, we thought there were lost opportunities to fulfill other goals and do other activities, implicit beliefs being an example, theories of intelligence, identity theories. We also thought there were social and psychological costs of punishment or rejection for violating norms. So all of those were part of how we were thinking about cost, and I'm really pleased that now it's becoming much more relevant in people's theories. The second piece is we also thought then about this new yellow set, and I'm essentially almost done. So these were the other psychological processes, the attributional processes that linked experience, essentially experiences over time, to the individual differences and group differences and expectancies and values. And finally, because we wanted to think of social structure, we nested all of those within the larger social system that the individual was in. And if I had to say where we should go is get out of these three at your far left and get into everything that's on the other side. We really need to go much more deeply into the processes that influence these expectancies and values, and into the cultural embeddedness and socialization models that lead to differences over time. So I'll stop with that.
Thanks so much, Dr. Eccles. Now we have Dr. Hellman also talking about expectancy value theory.
So this is Reflections from Founders and Descendants. I think maybe you might want to guess which one I am. But I don't know that I'm a founder. I'm talking about expectancy value theory, but I really feel like a descendant of achievement goal theory. And so I've been trying to figure out what's my historical connection to the folks up here. And so my advisor, Judith Harakevich, trained us on Atkinson's expectancy value models, and that's where I first learned about expectancy value theory. So I thought we have that kinship. The other thing I think for graduate students, if you're taking notes about the two most important things so far, one, if you want to make it, grow your hair out. And then two, if you get feedback you don't like, just send it to somebody else. Maybe we'll get So I have two reflections on expectancy value theory and where it's going now. And one is on the slide here as a result of a meta-analysis that Rory Lazowski and I did a couple of years back, identified the motivation interventions in education that were inspired by many of the theoretical models up here, but also others. And as you can see in the graph, we've got this nice increase coming along. And I'll say, we stopped our review around 2014, so I last night, quick after coming back from enjoying myself, found a few more articles. So I would say the current interventions are under-specified here, so there's certainly more, and many more are unpublished. But you can see there's a lot of interest in interventions, and this is a really important time in our field because theories are great, theories are important, correlational studies and observational studies are important, but we also need to operationalize our theories in the world through interventions to see, hey, if these ideas are so powerful, can we actually make a difference? And that's something that I think, for me, the expectancy value framework has helped inspire. And maybe more so than some of the other theoretical models, and it has to do with Jackie's point about the lighter colored boxes here that aren't just locused on the individual person and their agency, which is how I came in and got my training initially, but it's more sociological, it's more developmental, and that is really optimistic for people who are interested in interventions, because all the places I've highlighted in red here are places where you can go in and the context maybe matters for individual achievement motivation, and we can maybe bump those around, whether it's changing what teachers do or changing the curriculum or changing the structure of the environment. So there is a lot of hope here in these theoretical models, and I think that's probably one of the big reasons I gravitated towards expectancy value theory. In addition to the idea of utility value, which I'm actually not going to go into, there's been plenty of sessions on utility value. I feel like in some ways I'm a poster child for utility value, so I'm not going to talk about that a lot, but that's one aspect of this model that is right for interventions. There's others too. Some folks are starting to do cost interventions. Really excited to see where those go too. The second point I want to make that I think is really exciting about where expectancy value theory is going, and where I should say this framework is going, the work is inspiring, is around cost. And Jackie and her colleagues should be given a lot of credit for bringing that into these models, because so often we think about only the approach side of motivation and don't always think about the avoidance side of motivation. Chi McGool has talked about that. I don't know if Tim's going to talk about that later. But often we think about, hey, can I do this? Do I want to do it? And these things that are going to attract us. What about the obstacles that prevent us and from wanting to do that? And my colleague Ken Barron and I, for a long time, had always talked about, cost is so understudied. This is the early 2000s. It's so understudied, and is it a value? And we're not really sure it lives there. And so over time, we sort of developed our ideas, and eventually we came to be convinced that cost was misplaced in the model. But we really liked the model, and we really liked Jackie and Alan, and we were, we were descendants, and we didn't want the Ned Jones or the Kelly feedback. So eventually we got up the guts to go to Jackie and say, hey, here's our ideas. And as any of you who know Jackie, you wouldn't be surprised. She said, that's a great idea. I'm leading this special issue. Why don't you write a chapter on it? So instead of being defensive about the theory, she said, yeah, explore those ideas more. So the idea was, in our minds, in the lower box on the lower right-hand corner, that we should pull cost out of value and really think about it separately. And this is an unresolved issue right now. To honor Alan, who's not here, he doesn't exactly agree with that. So if I'm stepping in for Alan, he probably wouldn't say this exact thing. But what I am going to say is that I think this idea, this potentially provocative idea that cost maybe isn't a task value, it's something different, is pushing us to look at things and do things differently. And that's, I think, one of the great things about this model and where it's going, is inspiring us to think differently about a lot of the work that's been done already. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Dr. Helleman. Now we have Dr. Shunk.
Thanks, Alan. Well, I'm going to talk about social cognitive theory, and before I get started, I want to do a little personal disclaimer. I did my doctorate at Stanford, and I was Bandura's student, so Chris, I am a descendant also. But just to show that we're not entirely insulated in this profession, while I was at Stanford, I was very interested in attribution theory and the work of Kelly and Jones and Heider. And this man sitting right here, Bernie Weiner, and I corresponded with you. We corresponded a few times. He was very helpful, gave me a lot of good advice, and I ended up incorporating attributions into my dissertation. And then subsequently in several studies I did, I looked at the role of attributions. But I am going to be talking about social cognitive theory and to really look at things that we were asked to take a look at, some of the historical roots of the theory, what the current status and research focus is, and some anticipated future directions. So from the earliest, really, from the earliest versions, social cognitive theory has emphasized the importance of motivational and social variables in human development and in education. In 1954, Roeder formulated a theory of social learning that included two prominent motivational variables: expectancy, which was defined as an individual's belief about the likelihood that a particular reinforcement would occur following a specific behavior, and reinforcement value, or how much individuals value a particular outcome relative to other potential outcomes. Bandura's 1960 studies on modeling were based on theoretical predictions of the social learning theory. Bandura predicted that for observational learning to occur, for example, individuals had to attend to the model, had to retain what the model did, be able to produce the model behavior, and be motivated to do so. These early modeling studies also identified several model characteristics that could affect observers' motivation, such as perceived competence, model status, and perceived similarities to models. Broadly, motivation depends on the expected positive consequences for performing modeled actions. These expectancies, which are cognitive beliefs, are developed through social interactions. Then, in 1986, Bandura published his expanded, really, work on social cognitive theory, and in that he broadened his theory's approach by postulating reciprocal interactions between personal, behavioral, and environmental variables. Cognitive motivational beliefs are personal variables that influence behaviors and environments and are affected by them. In 1977, Bandura introduced the construct of self-efficacy, which he defined as personal capabilities to learn or perform actions at designated levels. Then in 1997, he published a volume on self-efficacy, and he discussed many ways in which individuals' self-efficacy beliefs can affect their choices, their persistence, their effort, and their achievement. Any of those, of course, is what we think of as motivational variables. Okay, well, what's the current status? Where are we today? Current social cognitive theoretical conceptions continue and certainly emphasize self-efficacy as a strong influence on motivation and achievement, but they also view motivation as involving goal-directed behaviors that are instigated and sustained by such other variables as outcome expectations, values, and attributions. Social cognitive researchers explore motivation in varied in and out-of-school settings, including at home and in social collaborative contexts. Researchers also are exploring social cognitive processes in settings involving technology and effects of variables across diverse cultures. Another active area of research is the process whereby self-efficacy beliefs develop and how they are impacted by contextual variables. A variety of instructional and social variables hypothesized to influence self-efficacy, including those associated with teachers, with peers, and with learning environments. Importantly, researchers are examining the process whereby self-efficacy beliefs are formed and change over time through such real-time measures as microanalytic methods, observations, think aloud, protocols, and interviews. Another active area of research is how students weigh and combine information from various sources to develop self-efficacy beliefs. I know there are people in the audience here who are doing that exact research. Students can be exposed to conflicting information. For example, they may view peers succeed and their teachers may provide encouragement to them, but when they work at tasks, they then encounter difficulty. And so how they resolve those discrepancies, I think, is very important, and it remains a very active area for research. So then the issue is, well, where do we go from here? I think there's a lot of potential directions, and I've only indicated a handful of them on this chart. We certainly need to know more about perceived similarity of observers to models. Researchers have shown that the influence of gender and ethnicity on the development of self-efficacy and goals in different areas. But research is really needed to identify how potentially important dimensions such as native language and students' accent, for example. Those are all personal characteristics that may play a very influential role in the effectiveness of models to students. Social cognitive theory, I believe, would benefit from more of a developmental emphasis. That's typically been a weak area in the theory. I don't know if I'd say a weak area, just maybe an underexplored area. And especially important is how motivational variables, such as self-efficacy and outcome expectations, are influenced by children's cognitive development. As a better integration, I think, with human development should improve our understanding of the operation of motivational variables. And I think we also need continual exploration of cultural and contextual variables. In some cultures, for example, individual self-efficacy may be far less important for motivation than collective self-efficacy. And I think understanding cultural processes has important implications for theory and for educational practice. And lastly, I recommend research in how the integration of technology with instruction may provide sources of self-efficacy information to learners. Systematic intervention research that provides self-efficacy information via technology from the various sources, such as performance, vicarious experiences, and social persuasions, I think would help to clarify how students weigh and combine information from different sources, as well as how these sources can in turn affect their academic motivation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Shunk. Now we have Dr. DC.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Rich Ryan is in Australia, but he is wholly involved with everything I say today. I don't know if he would agree, but I'm contributing it to him anyway. For us, the idea of motivation is all about energy. That is the core and most important aspect of what motivation means. So that means it's what moves you to learn and behave. Traditionally in economics and in psychology, motivation has been treated as a unitary concept, by which I mean mostly people are just interested in the amount of motivation. But from the time we started working in motivation, our idea was that the amount is really not the most important thing. In fact, there are different types of motivation that function very differently. And so our point of view has always been to work with types of motivation much more than with amount. In self-determination theory, the primary distinction is between autonomous motivation and controlled motivation. Autonomous motivation, you are autonomously motivated probably when you fully endorse a behavior and experience volition and willingness while doing it. In contrast, you are probably controlled in your motivation when you feel coerced or seduced into doing it with the experience of pressure and obligation. Autonomous motivation comes in two flavors. Intrinsic motivation, which is where the research all started, going back into the late 60s, but also extrinsically motivated when it has been fully internalized and accepted as one's own. The outcomes associated with a high level of autonomous motivation involve greater persistence in learning activities, better conceptual understanding, more flexibility in thinking and problem solving, creativity, more heuristic kinds of thinking and performance, better health and well-being, both physiological and psychological, and these important functional effects have been shown to hold up across genders, across socioeconomic status, across cultures, and across the lifespan. Controlled motivation, external rewards and punishment contingencies. Partially internalized, we call it introjected. That word floated around before we latched onto it. The introjection of extrinsic motivation that have not been accepted as one's own. So we've got then essentially two subtypes of autonomous motivation and two subtypes of controlled motivation. Okay, the outcomes associated with high controlled motivation, in contrast, are quite different. What most people are trying to get is compliance, and if they have what they need to, like enough money or enough A pluses, they can probably get it. But wherever you find compliance, there's also a desire and tendency for defiance. The two go hand in hand, and both represent types of control. Rigid thinking, short-term learning. I say emphasize the short term because when people's motivation is controlled and they memorize, they forget it pretty quickly, and there's a lot of research showing that. Algorithmic performance, they're good at that. You know, they can follow steps, boom, boom, boom. Alienation and disaffection is the kind of affect that's involved with it. And interesting for me has always been the shortest path to outcomes. If what you're focused on is the outcomes, then what you're probably, well, some people will do some of the time is take the shortest path to get there. We see it now in high-stakes testing all over the place. What's the easiest way to get there, to get the level of achievement we're looking for? The answer is lie, cheat, and steal. And anybody that's been following it, they're gaming the system all over the place. And diminished psychological and physical health. Okay, so the first part of self-determination theory has to do with the differentiation of types of motivation. And the second really key part has to do with our belief, based on a lot of research, that all human beings, I did say all, didn't I? That is to say, universal. All human beings have three fundamental psychological needs. That's a controversial statement. Most people agree that we have physiological needs. I have never heard somebody, a psychologist or otherwise, argue that we don't need oxygen or water. But when it comes to psychological needs, they argue that there aren't such things, that we learn them from our culture, from our groups, or whatever. We don't agree with that. We think that it's really something that's universal and inherent. So the three needs are competence. Competence is studied a lot in goal theories and in social cognitive theories all over the place. And basically, we agree, well, most people don't think of it as a need, but we do. But, so you know what it's all about. The second is relatedness, the same thing there. You know, if you, and I should just say, when we say needs, what we mean by needs is that it is something that is essential. If you get it, you have enhancement in psychological well-being and a host of other kind of outcomes. And if you don't get it, you have detriments in those very same kinds of things. And so, relatedness, we all know what it's like to get rejected. It's preferable to be accepted, usually. And finally, the need for autonomy. I've been talking about autonomy, but the point that this is making is that autonomy is in fact actually, from our perspective, a fundamental and basic psychological need. Basic need satisfaction and internalization. Cool. Okay, I'll just say quickly, the social context that maintains intrinsic motivation, which is where the research all started, are essentially the same as those that promote internalization of extrinsic motivation. So autonomous motivation, it's the same kinds of conditions that promote both kinds of autonomous motivation. And what it is support for the satisfaction of the three fundamental psychological needs. This is probably the most important slide, so I'll say it the fastest. How you create need-supportive social contexts, relate from the student's perspective. That is always the starting place. Well, it's only students if what we're talking about is teachers and students, but children or employees or whatever, the other's perspective is the starting place. Encouraging self-initiation and exploration, offer relevant choices, make instruction relevant to their lives, provide optimal challenge, offer meaningful rationales. That's an important one, actually. And basically, it just boils down, do you have enough respect for the other person that if you're going to ask them to do something, you'll say why? Give positive feedback, be interested and engaged as a teacher. The more interested the teacher is in whatever he or she is teaching, the more likely the students will get interested in it as well. Okay, so where are we going from here? We agree with the business about interventions. We've been doing them for about 40-some years, and we're all endorsing that. So, but what are we doing actually? Well, we're going up and we're going down. We're going up in the sense of looking at economic and political influences in the whole process, and we're going down by looking at brain processes. So that's a lot of what's coming, well, what's going on and will continue to come. And finally, I would just say that for the last several years, Rich, Ryan, and I have been spending a substantial amount of our time writing a book called Self-Determination Theory, which is about 800 pages long. It is down at the Guilford booth, and at 11 o'clock today, they're doing some kind of hoopla around.
Thank you, Dr. DC. And finally, we have Dr. Erden.
Hi. First, I want to thank Alan and Allison, especially Allison, who's done so much to organize the event and get it together, and to Ellen for working on the bigger room. Really appreciate it. I was a grad student at the University of Michigan, and was very excited. I wanted to work in Jackie's lab like everybody did. And she said, "Are you going to do something about that hair?" And hair is very important to me. It seemed like a major cost to change the color. So I said, "No, I think I'll go work with Marty Mayer and Carol Mitchell," which turned out to be, fantastic. The title of my talk is a brief history of achievement goal theory, IMHO. That's my shout out to the youth of the audience, trying to stay current. At this point in my life, youth is anybody under 50. But it's also an acknowledgement that I'm not the spokesperson for achievement goal theory. There's many people in this room that could probably do a better job of describing, the roots and the current directions of achievement goal theory. So this is very much my own perspective. Andy Elliott wrote a great chapter in 2005 that really laid out, here's the foundations of the theory and here's where it came from. And so I put as much as I could remember from that into my own presentation. These are the 4 people who are generally credited with being the founders of achievement goal theory. My primary mentor was Marty Mayer on the left, who we recently recently passed away, so sad news about that. But he was a great mentor. His friend and colleague, John Nichols, was with him. Carol Dweck and Carol Ames, and for a brief period they were all at the University of Illinois, where there was sort of an incubation of this idea that emerged into achievement goal theory. From my perspective, although they all sort of came up with the theory together, they all sort of came at it from slightly different angles. And Carol Dweck, I think, really was bringing more of an attribution theory and a sort of learned helplessness perspective to the table. John Nichols, although he also, along with Carol Dweck, was looking at theories of intelligence and how those develop and play out. He had a very strong interest in democratic ideals of education, which I'll get into a bit more. Carol Ames was very rooted in the classroom context, and that was in the late 80s and early 90s. She made major contributions by saying what's happening in the classroom, how does that contribute to the goals that students adopt. And then Marty Mayer had developed a theory of personal investment that sort of morphed into these achievement goals. And his theory of personal investment has several different investment routes, but it kind of got boiled down to mastery and performance. And there were many other people who were at the forefront. So these are the 4 people that are generally given credit for kind of creating the theory, but there are lots of people involved from early on. Okay, so from my perspective, achievement goal theory has kind of developed along 2 tracks. And one of them is the science. So what are goals? How do we define them? What counts as a goal and what doesn't count as an achievement goal? I was always kind of perplexed when I first got into achievement goal theory, like why are there only 2 when we know that people have all these goals? But achievement goals aren't defined the same way as goals in general. There's a very specific sort of definition. So that's been one avenue. What are the antecedents and consequences of different kinds of achievement goals? And that's the science side. The other part of achievement goal theory is the philosophy side. What's the purpose behind these different goal pursuits? And that's the one that got me really interested in grad school. So I'll talk about each of them. On the science side, as I mentioned, definition, measurement, understanding mediators, moderators of different achievement goals. And I think that we've made a lot of progress here, and I think that we continue to make a lot of progress here, understanding what goals are, what they're related to, how different combinations of cognitions work to influence motivation. In my view, I think that although there's made a lot of progress, in some ways I keep coming back to this, it looks like approach forms of goals are good and avoidance forms of goals are bad. And not sure what else to do with that, but I think that's because I'm not really working in the field anymore. I think other people are making significant contributions there. So I'll spend the rest of my time sort of talking about this because this is the one that interests me the most. The philosophy side of achievement goals is, what is the purpose of school? I think that was sort of a guiding question. And how should success be defined there? Now, theories of motivation are generally developed and defined to be as universal as possible. How do we understand human motivation? I don't think goal theory was born that way. I think goal theory was born in a different way around how do we optimize the experiences of children in schools? And kids in schools are different than people in the workplace, than people on teams. Kids in schools have to be there. and they're judged. And failure is part of the equation, whether they like it or not. Now, if I, am playing on a team, and I play on many teams, I go in understanding that losing might be part of the game, and if I don't like it, I quit. Well, I shouldn't say that. That doesn't reflect very well on me. I have the option of quitting, is what I meant to say. That's not an option for kids. And so I think some of the early framers and adopters of goal theory were looking at it like, how do we make it so that we have fewer kids who are forced to be in school failing? How do we make it so it's an experience where we don't just beat them down from the time that they're 10 years old? Is there another way? And I think that's what was sort of a motivational force behind the theory. Okay. In 1970, Maslow wrote this, and I think that this is a foundational quote for the idea of performance goals in particular. We've been learning more and more of the dangers of basing self-esteem on the opinions of others rather than on real capacity, competence, and adequacy for the task. The most stable and therefore most healthy self-esteem is based on deserved respect from others rather than on external fame or celebrity, thank you very much, and unwarranted adulation. I think the early foundations of performance goals, they were called ego goals by some, because it was about, is this about my own aggrandizement? Is this about how others are judging me? Is this about how I look? Is this about impressing other people? And I think in the subsequent years, we've really come to define achievement goals, performance goals, as not so much ego-based, but more social comparison-based. And it's been important for defining the ideas and getting a better articulation of what we're talking about, because it was a mess. Everybody was talking about something different. But it's kind of shifted away from this, and I think that this was sort of a foundational piece, especially for people like Nichols. And in Dweck's work, her early work was about, other people are looking at you now. How's that affect how you perform? Okay, so I think that one of the original propositions was that in the US, which is an individualistic society, the guiding principle is that competition makes everything better. It's the basis of our economic model. And I think what was really exciting for me as a grad student about goal theory was they questioned that. Marty Merrick, Carol Midgley, this was a real big issue for her, was, is that really the best model? It's not, the case isn't that competition doesn't make people perform better. That's not really the argument. The argument is, if you're not going to win the competition, is there any reason to stay invested? And in school, a lot of kids aren't going to win. Is there some way for them to stay invested? So that's the fundamental belief, I think, of several people. Nichols' names was, how do we keep kids invested if we're going to define the game as winners and losers? How do we change the definition of the game? So what I'd really love to see, and I don't have a lot of skin in the game because I haven't been looking at goal theory for a while, but what I'd love to see in goal theory, and some people might be doing this, is a return to these big questions. How important is the social comparison part? Given the complexities of social comparison, with the upward comparison and the downward comparison, is social comparison really the key here? Or is it really about more of this ego issue? How do I look? How am I being judged? Has this framework and this really clear definition on these two goals caused us to overlook some other things that we know are really important for students in the school? And then the really big question, how is goal theory affecting what happens in schools? And I think that we can see evidence that it is, especially mindset stuff has really got a foundation in goal theory. But this bigger question of what's the definition of achievement in school? How is success defined in school? And can we shift that so that more students are able to remain invested to reach their potential rather than to try and win? Thank you.
Thanks so much to Dr. Urden, and again to all of our panelists for sharing all of those thoughts. I'd now like to invite Dr. Graham to share and ask some of her questions of the panelists. Sure, whatever you prefer. What would you like to do? Okay.
Thank you, Allison. So I'm actually.
Hold on. Let me just turn it on. The record was- Okay.
I'm actually a sort of last-minute replacement for Alan. He organized this. He would have been here and he would have been thrilled to be here seeing this great turnout, listening to these wonderful perspectives. So whatever kept him from being here today, I wish him well. So shout out to Alan. Okay, questions from me. Allison asked me to develop a few questions, maybe for about 15 minutes. We're going to try to keep on time so that then there can be plenty of time for you in the audience to ask your questions. So I'll try to do 3 questions. About 25 years ago, I'm dating myself now too, I published an article in the American Psychologist with the title, "Most of the Subjects Were White and Middle Class." And in that article, I reviewed 20 years of research in the major psychology journals, the journals that all of our esteemed presenters here were and continue to publish in. And in that review, I talked about how poorly African Americans, the focus on African Americans, were represented in the studies published in these journals, and that it was declining over time. And at the end of the article, I made the point that in the world, most of the people are not white and middle class, so why should our journals be so disproportionately representative of that population? Well, I raise this today because we know that the world is a lot more demographically diverse, and the U.S. in particular, than when I was writing this article in 1992. And the very excellent summaries that all of these presenters said, never was the word race, ethnicity mentioned. I think today Dale was the only person who mentioned ethnicity. So my question is, I'm not going to ask you whether you've been concerned with diversity in your studies elaborating the theory, but I do want to ask you how important you think this issue is. And so looking at your theory as a whole and the ethnic representation of samples, do you think that most of the subjects were white and middle class? And if the answer is yes, maybe, or I'm not sure, how can you then assure the young scholars and the senior scholars in this audience, because there are a lot of you here too, how can you assure scholars who are concerned with racial ethnic diversity of our population that your theory has generality and relevance? Big picture question. Who wants to?
Oh, boy. Turn down this. These on? Are they on? Yes. Okay. Well, I think that's a really important question, and I'm probably so I've done three longitudinal studies. 2 of them are primarily white, but not middle class. They're broadly representative of the social economic classes. And one of them includes a substantial number of African Americans, and then one study that is basically a majority African Americans that we followed over time. But I think the question needs to be framed in a way of, and there's 2 ways of thinking about it. One is the theory generalizable to various groups, but the other way is that not working? Is that working? Yes. Okay. I think the issue is, in what ways does ethnicity feed into the theory? So you can look at it in 2 ways. You can say, well, have you done other samples to see whether it works? And basically in our work, everyone that's done it with other samples finds it works, generalizes. I mean, it looks pretty universal as Ed's work has been showing. But I think the more important question for me would be, how does ethnicity actually feed into it? How does it become one of the things that feeds into individual and group differences? And we actually did talk a lot about that because our theory emerged from a worry about gender. So gender roles and identities were very central to what we did in our theory, and ethnicity can in some ways fit in that same framing. So we've tried to think about, when we've thought about bringing in something like ethnicity, how is it that ethnicity operates in a way that ends up producing group differences at the mean level in these beliefs? So how do we get from the group into which one is born to, as an adult, having a probabilistically different view of one's competencies and one's values? And I think that's opening lots of interesting questions when you sort of take that and try to run it through. How are the many ways in which any cultural factor, ethnicity being one, actually ends up shaping the pathway a person takes so developmentally through this particular, through the model, through our model.
Anybody else want to comment?
Sure. We've done some work that is involved ethnicity and race. The biggest study that I can think of was a randomized clinical trial around issues of, I'll say, smoking cessation, tobacco use. And it was there were 1,000 people in the trial, and it was overwhelmingly very low SES and therefore higher of the minority groups. But we haven't done an awful lot, I would say. We take a somewhat different approach, although I'm not saying that what Sandra is speaking about isn't hugely important, and that is a cross-cultural approach. We've done a lot of work in a lot of countries. There's one study where the results are just being analyzed now from 19 countries, for example, and it was Chris Nemec who was leading it, and what he did was ask people in these 19 different countries to think about the best teacher they ever had and the worst teacher they ever had. And just for simplicity, he finds, for example, that overwhelmingly autonomy support or need support was the thing that across all those countries people said was the most important thing. I mean, the best teacher turned out to be the most important thing for their best teacher. And no place in any of the 19 countries did things like control, grade focus. Those never came up in the what was being described for the best teachers. Some of those things came up in the ones for the worst teachers. So my last thing I would say is, I said we believe that the basic psychological needs are universal. We do. But we also believe that the way in which they get satisfied is a function of race, ethnicity, culture, and so on. It's not that we all do it the same way. It's only that we need to experience relatedness, we need to experience competence, and we need to experience autonomy for optimal well-being.
So one more, Tim, you wanted to say something about this? Or?
Yeah, let me make a couple of comments on that. I think you made some really good points, Ed. In social cognitive theory, the principles are assumed to be general, but then how they're applied and the particular characteristics involved are certainly going to be a function of many factors, one of which certainly would be background characteristics, ethnicity, racial identity, and things like that. And this is something, I mean, I work with teachers in my classes, and we talk about, and one thing I mentioned in my talk today are what are effective model characteristics. And you look at American education today, and there's a tremendous influence, influx of refugee and immigrant children, for example, and to take a look at that and say, well, who are effective motivational models for these children? It's probably not going to be the white middle-class children that we might otherwise be exposed to. So how those principles get translated is definitely going to be a function of, as Ed said, a number of variables, one very important of which would be racial and ethnic identity.
I'll be brief. I just think I'm going to say something a little bit different. I think if you were to rewrite that paper, it would be most of the panelists are white and middle class. I got into motivation. I got into motivation and male, absolutely. But I've always been interested in diversity. That's what got me interested in motivation research. And I always feel like as I'm interpreting my data, I'm very limited in what I can understand. I just don't feel like I bring the frame to fully understand what I'm seeing or to ask the questions. that I would probably ask different questions if I didn't bring the frame that I bring as a white man. And so I think it's really important to diversify the people who are asking the questions and interpreting the research as well.
So Tim, I completely agree with that, and very hesitant when I was asked to replace Alan because I felt like I was just replicating all the other bias here. But as I look around the room and I see David Yeager over here primes me, doing a lot of great intervention work to try to close racial achievement gaps, for example, with intervention work. There's something I've noticed that I think we've got to be careful of, which is studying race as a variable, for example, versus the understanding the phenomena. And Tim, I think your comment is really important here, that if we're just studying as a variable, we go in, we do our intervention, we graduate more African American, Latina students, and we feel great, versus do we really understand what that experience is like, and how is it informing how we think about motivation or whatever it is with our interventions?
Bernie wants to
I don't know, Ed passed it to this fellow over here. I got left out. I'm trying to decide. Well, I'm a main effect person. And I still think you build theories by looking for main effects. And the question for me about race is there something fundamentally different about the theory? So they could differ on the level of a variable, but is the process different? I have no reason to think that if I attribute my failure to low ability, my expectancy will probably go down or something. Is that going to differ between races? Is there something fundamentally different? I don't think so. So, to me, if you're interested in motivational theory, you want to say, where am I going to pick up the variance? How will I still the waters to see a little deeper and decrease the complexity? So, I'm not sure that would be a focus of mine, or a necessary component of a motivational theory. That doesn't mean that the groups don't differ in a number of ways, but that doesn't change the relationships that the theories are specifying. So I don't know if that differs for people here, but it maybe is a little bit different in terms of the fear I would experience of saying, well, who's your sample? I don't care who my sample is really, because I'm looking for similarities.
Okay. We'll come back to that if there's time. I do care about the samples. I think I'm trying to do theory too. Okay, so next question. School-based interventions, and Chris brought that up in his overview. School-based interventions guided by motivational theories seem to be enjoying a newfound popularity. Several research syntheses on motivation or closely related social psychological interventions have been published in the last few years, including the review and research meta-analysis that Chris referred to in the beginning. And I look back at that, it was quite impressive. There were 74 studies, 92 effect sizes, 38,000 participants. And in the recently published second edition of the Handbook of Motivation and Competence, I think some of the editors are here today, Andy Elliott and David Yeager. Carol Dweck is the third one. These editors asked all of the chapter contributors to discuss applications in their chapters, which for most of them resulted in a discussion of intervention. So the question is, given all this empirical activity, how would you assess the state of the art on motivation interventions guided by your theory? Is there strong evidence for improvements in achievement-related behavior based on changing motivation as you conceptualize it? And in your view, what's the next step in intervention research? So is there a literature guided by your theory that's changing behavior? And if yes, great. If not, what's the next step? Don't all
Start that in.
order. Who wants to talk about intervention?
Start that in.
Well, to answer your questions, yes, I think there's a lot of evidence that interventions are effective. I think it's overwhelming, and the biggest issue I have is we know they're effective, but we're not quite sure why. And it's a process issue. Motivation is dynamic. It's always changing. It changes from moment to moment, and it's not the same at the start of a teaching sequence as it is in the middle or at the end. And I think measurement-wise is where we really have work to do, because measurements of motivation have tended to be very static, occur at fixed points and times, and all we can do is see change from pre to post, but we don't know what's happening in the process along the way. And motivation is supposedly very dynamic, but yet we're using very static kind of measures for it. And I see that as an important next step to answer the question, okay, we know the intervention is effective, we've got evidence on that, now why? And what's happening in this context with these particular participants?
Anybody else? Focusing on your particular theoretical orientation.
Well, from a goal theory perspective, I think one of the things that was interesting about the intervention work is it became really clear quickly how complex the education system is and how difficult it is to sort of single out a goal, to single out any goal, and in particular a mastery or achievement goal. There's just so many different levels of demands that even if the teacher's doing something that's really focusing on mastery goals in the classroom, there's some state testing demand, or there's some policy at the school, or there's some tracking system, or there's something that's countering that. And I think that the intervention research that's goal theory based sort of slowed down as a result of people just saying, man, I'm not sure that we can make a lot of headway here. I think there has been, as I mentioned before, the MindSense intervention is probably the closest thing that we have now to goal theory-based intervention. And I think that has had some good effects. But I think for the most part, that's kind of an attribution intervention, probably more than a goal intervention.
15 minutes up.
Yes, but if you...
Well, I want to just make sure that the audience has plenty of time
Sure.
to ask questions. Anybody else want to say something about intervention?
Go ahead. There's not a lot of attribution intervention, but there certainly is a body of literature, especially Ray Perry of Canada. But the data look good, and he has a huge database. But again, the number of studies and the number of people doing it really needs to increase. And the how it's done is always an issue, but it's clear what you want to do is that you want to somehow stop dysfunctional attributions, like I'm dumb, and so that is very close to some of the other type of interventions. And you want to introduce what are functional attributions, which is, I didn't try hard enough, was poor strategy. The data, when you do that, are not bad, but a lot more work needs to be done.
As I said, we've been doing intervention research for a long time, and because self-determination theory has been applied across pretty much every domain of life, there's some education. John Marshall Reeve has done the best work in terms of the education interventions. When I started, the first intervention I did was in a Fortune 500 company. And the nature of the interventions that we've done, a lot of them also have been in healthcare. I mentioned the smoking cessation, but also with relation to diabetes and various other things in that domain. But we do it in one of two ways. One is to train authority figures, managers, parents, teachers, physicians, and so on, to be more need supportive. So then they go and do that, and it makes a difference when they do it. First off, they can learn it. The research shows that, and it makes a difference for their subordinates or students, whoever it is. So that's one way. And the other thing we do is actually set up, like we set up a clinic, for example, and we're running it for several years, in which we actually have approaches to making the health-related changes that was what we were interested in. So.
He reminded me about the health. I didn't go into that domain, but there is a number of attribution change programs related to health, especially with the aged. So don't attribute your lack of exercise to old age. That's a dysfunctional attribution. So they try and change that, and that's led to, even that's true. That's led to especially measurement of walking behavior and increased exercises, and in turn better health outcomes.
So I want to add something, because I want to put a note of caution. So you've heard, actually, there are two ways that we can think of interventions that are motivationally based, and I think you heard it very nicely in what Ed was talking about in comparison to what the rest of us talk about. We can intervene with the kid and change them because we think something's wrong with them. Or we can change the environments that they are in so that they, in fact, will thrive better. I think one of the, unfortunately, those of us that have focused so much on motivation being in the head as opposed to being in the environment have really focused attention on changing the kid. And we've got lots of interventions like that, and they will produce changes. But I worry that is distracting us from a more fundamental need, which is to change the nature of schools. If we're talking about kids, change the nature of universities, and change the nature of the social world that we're living in. And that is where we really need to be moving. Can we, in fact, change the contexts so that the kids will then make the attributions that we think are important, because those attributions are, in fact, true. We're not convincing them to, in fact, make false attributions so that they can, in fact, survive somehow in an environment that isn't particularly healthy for them. So I think we are, in fact, partially responsible for this focus so much on motivation being something that's in the kid as opposed to a reasonable response to an environment that's pretty dysfunctional.
I want to invite the audience to elaborate on these questions or any other questions that you are thinking of.
I will switch microphones with you so I can bring this microphone around.
Oh, you're going to walk around? I was going to do that. Okay. So I think we have like 30 minutes. So over here, come on, shout loud or come find a mic. Oh, good. Okay.
Thank you very much. I'm a cognitive psychologist, Helena Badze, who retired from the World Bank after 27 years of trying to figure all this out in four schools, and I was teachers with the equivalent of third grade. There is, I would like, a great deal of neuroscience these days, and I would like very much to hear why we don't hear anything about it. The role of the mesolimbic dopamine. The circuits, for example, that encode in prediction errors. And furthermore, the role of the understanding of evolutionary psychology that really reconfigures everything. It's wonderful that you guys, and I'm your age, sat and figured this out in the 50s, 60s, 70s. But by now, neuroscience rewrites the whole thing. There is a load of motivation experiments that then need to be rethought on this basis. And I wonder who is going to be doing that when we hear nothing about neuroscience and mesolimbic dopamine circuits and all that in this audience. Thank you.
Role of neuroscience. Who's going to take it? You have yours?
Yeah.
Well, I'll just make one comment about that. I certainly agree with what you're saying. There's not much on it. And in fact, what the motivational literature on neuroscience is even though it's getting better, it's getting more complete, it's getting more thorough, it is still very heavily rooted in what I would call behavioral psychology, really with a focus on rewards and pleasure centers in the brain, and how does all that work. In motivation, we say there's a lot of factors that can motivate individuals. besides rewards, goals for interests and values and costs and things like that, as many of the things we've heard about today. And at this point, I don't think that the neuroscience literature is extensive enough to really be able to address that very much. That will change, certainly, as neuroscientific methods are getting far more precise and more naturalistic. And I think in the next few years we're going to be seeing a much more extensive neuroscience literature on motivation.
I think there's lots of work that's beginning to come out when we think about things like interests. So where areas have in fact looked most closely at the brains is the work by Heady and Renninger. And they're really talking about, well, what is this thing called interest? And how is it manifest in the reward systems in the brain? And they're beginning to do that kind of work. But I think part of the problem is when you put someone in a scanner, you can't get very much motivated engagement. I mean, that is a very restrictive setting in which you can study. So what we're going to know about what happens out of that scanner is going to be a while until we have the technology to actually be able to look at some of those microprocesses in more authentic situations. But it's coming, and it's a great point. I think evolutionary. I'm going to actually hand this over to Rick, to Ed. I get the two of you see you're mixing up the names. It's the same face. So they've thought more about that in their terms of your universal needs, and they're also doing some work, I think, on those topics.
First, I want to say that there's this idea of level of analysis and where you choose to focus your level of analysis. And in part, most of us have been at a psychological level, but some focused on, as Jackie pointed out so clearly, on the individual, the student, for example, but others on the social context. In self-determination theory, we've spent by far most of our time on the social context because we wanted to think about how do you make a school that's a better school for administrators, teachers, and students to be in, and how do you make clinics better, and how do you make homes better, all the time thinking about what social contextual elements are necessary for that. So for decades, that's the primary thing that we've done. But now, as I said, we're not only moving to the higher level, but to the lower level. And Rich Ryan is doing much more of that than I am, along with Stefano Di Domenico and others. But it interests us a lot. Still, though, we're always wondering, okay, we want to know more about brain processes. So there are studies, for example, that show the undermining of intrinsic motivation by rewards, done in the magnet, for example. Ko Murayama is amongst the people doing that. So we do think it's important, but still there's always this business of how are you going to make changes in the world? And the brain process research is not yet very close to being able to do what the psychological research can do.
I just want to make a quick plug for the latest volume of Advances in Motivation and Achievement is focused on neuroscience and brain-based processes of motivation, which I have nothing to do with. We have to farm it out.
So who are the people, just out of curiosity, who are the people who are writing about it? Do you know, Tim?
Ko has a chapter in there, and that's all I remembered.
Go get it to find out.
I don't know. I don't think I need the mic.
Just in case.
From New York.
That's okay. Just to make sure that everybody can hear you.
I'm Sarah Truebridge, and I worked in policy in New York. Then I became a practitioner and then I worked in research, and I'm now back working in the schools. And my comment is, I think there are more of us. I want to give, first of all, you're all my highlighter idols. So first of all, thank you for being here, and this is a real treat for me. But I think there are more people in schools doing the work that is based on your work than you're aware of. And I say that because one of the issues I have personally, and I've talked to a lot of educators, is that we have to figure out where we're investing our time. And time is such a commodity. And so for me personally, and I know that this story resonates with others who are doing the same work that I'm doing in schools, we're doing the work and we'd like to combine it with doing the research, but we have to make decisions. Do we do the work? Do we do the research? And then also finding the people to collaborate, or the institutions or the founders to collaborate to support the research and the work that we're doing, so that we can publicize in the journals that are being read, where people recognize that the work is being done actually. So I'm grateful to the AERA. I've been coming for many years, and I'm grateful that it is expanding to include more practitioners. Not only practitioners, but students themselves, so we can hear their voices. But we need still more of a breaking down of the silos. So I wanted to let you know your work is being done in the schools. It's just hard to get it out there. And what can we do to create more bonds between research and practice?
So I'll just say one thing about we as researchers working with school people and districts, we need funding to do that. So the WT Grant Foundation has a new initiative on exactly this partnership. So people who school districts partnering, getting together with academics, if it were motivation, the kind of work that we do, and really being able to do something meaningful. But you need support to do that. So the WT Grant Foundation at least is trying to move in that direction. Anybody else want to comment on that? Or you really just wanted to put that out there, right?
Well, I'm looking for comments too about how to connect with you, how to make those connections. We come to, we're here, and
anybody want to comment on that? How to encourage, support, nurture?
Yeah, I think the researcher-practitioner partnership is costly on both sides. So for researchers too, who are worried about publications and young scholars, it takes a lot of time to develop relationships. So it goes both ways. I hear you. And there are several national partnerships out there. The Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching has one. Camille Farrington's here at Chicago. They have some really cool stuff. But I think it's linking into these other communities of practitioners and researchers doing it together. But we're a long way from figuring out how can we make it win-wins for both sides. And I think that we got to develop models and methods, and all, because we got trained on methodologies of rigor and theory and empiricism, not on methods of translation. And so encouragement from people like you is great, but also engagement in those communities. And it's a challenge for us as a research community to figure it out.
I'm here if anybody wants to talk to me.
Afterwards.
Every 3 years, we have a conference, an international conference on self-determination theory. The last one was a year ago in Victoria, and the next one will be in 2 years in Amsterdam. But we spend 4 or 5 days together talking about self-determination theory. And one of the things I've noticed, and there have been, I think, 7 of them so far, and one of the things I've noticed is that in the last couple of years, there's been a substantial increase in practitioners who've been coming to them. We get about 700 people for each conference, and it's more and more being added to by practitioners rather than just the academic researchers. And so those kinds of things actually are getting started within our group.
More questions?
Hi, I'm Phil Winnie. I've got a very generous funder who's helping me develop an intervention that involves parents, teachers, and students. And I have the opportunity to travel to talk to each of you. And I'd like to know, would some of you find an element of my intervention part of the big ticket to success, where others of you would say, that won't matter, and others of you might say, that'll actually hurt?
Yes?
Or alternatively, why am I asking this question? Sure. I'm wondering if there's an element of an intervention where some of you would say that's part of the ticket to success, others of you would say that won't matter, and others of you would say it'll actually hurt.
You mean you want suggestions from us on particular parts of an intervention?
Well, I'm asking is that can you imagine an element where there's such either disagreement or indifference that we get diversity in your theories?
I'll bet we all think that kids need support from adults and teachers need support from their administrators and so on. Any intervention is certainly going to, in whatever form it takes, and we use different languages and so on, but for everybody, we believe that, I think, that support is really important.
And I think that the belief that you can succeed. I mean, that effort is important, you can succeed, and you should be focused on learning rather than outdoing others. I mean, I think we actually have very little disagreement on what would be the ultimate recommendation.
I disagree with that. I don't know if I want to say anything. There are aspects of other theories, other than attribution theory, there are aspects of it that I think are incorrect, and I think are misleading, and I think are wrong. So yes, I do think you can have an intervention that some of us would say it's a great intervention, others would say that's bad, and others would say who cares. So I agree with the way you phrased that question.
I think the conversation about performance approach goals would fit that, where there's people who have published that say it doesn't matter, it's not really a big goal of students. There's people that say one intervention strategy would be to try and help students develop their performance approach goals and combine them with mastery goals so that they can have the most adaptive profile for the environment. And then there's a third group that would say the intervention should focus on not emphasizing or de-emphasizing performance approach goals. So I think that one's, and that's been talked about a lot already in the literature.
So, Phil, you mentioned families and kids and teachers, so, is this on? It's on. Yeah. You know, so bringing the cultural argument to the table, for me, when you involve parents, it depends on what you're asking them to do. I think some parental focused interventions could have iatrogenic effects. If the whole argument is that you have to be there and the researcher defines a certain level of parental involvement in order to promote positive achievement by their kids, that's going to depend on the parents, whether or not they have the language to communicate with the teaching staff, whether or not their work life allows them to go to school often and participate in these interventions. So to me, when you bring families into the context, then the whole cultural context of research and interventions really come to the table. And there might be some disagreement about what we ask families to do.
And I would just say there's Greg Walton, Jeff Cohen, and Dave Yeager written a series of articles on wise interventions and some of the elements, regardless of what what content is psychologically you're trying to deliver. There's ways to make it non-stigmatizing, non-threatening, etc. So that I could say, you could take something that's potentially good, like growth mindset perhaps, and you could deliver in a way that's very stigmatizing. So I think that's another thing to think about, and there's some literature out there on that.
There certainly are theoretical differences. We're not all saying exactly the same thing up here. But at the same time, even though there are a lot of common processes you hear in competence, self-efficacy, for example, autonomy, agency, a lot of terms like that. You say, well, what really is the difference between those? Aren't they all pretty similar? And if the answer is probably yes, they probably are pretty similar, although they may be defined a little differently. But there still are theoretical differences as far as how these processes operate in any kind of context and what other influences might come into play.
Thank you. I'd like to follow up a little bit on something that Dr. Eccles said, that Jackie said, that I thought was really important. One of the things that strikes me when we talk about educational interventions is that for the most part we are talking about trying to change the way children think or the way they feel about themselves, their intelligence beliefs. And yet if I look at what I think are the huge problems that some of you acknowledged facing education right now, they're a reflection of our larger society, which is we have a society that's very divided, and race, class, and gender are power constructs. They're not just neutral descriptor constructs. They describe access to education. They describe the quality of educational opportunity that you have. We have a Secretary of Education who would effectively like to deny education to many of the people who need it the most. And so in that context, when I think about motivation and the kinds of achievements that we need to get fundamental changes in the kinds of experiences students have, it seems that it requires a level of motivation that's not about the individual, but it's about people working together. And so I wonder if you have any insights from your theories, not on my own self-determination or my own sense of what matters, but collectively what we can do and what we can teach children to do to be advocates for environments that support their motivation. And I hope that makes sense.
I always talk if someone gets a question. I of course agree with you, and we actually have examples, so I'll cite one. So the Institute for Research and Reform on Education, headed by Jim Connell. I mean, so he worked very closely with Ed and with Rich and people in the self-determination theory world. And he then dropped out of academia and actually went out and said, I'm going to work with districts. And he developed a model that wasn't based on changing individual kids, but said, let's start at the top and work out exactly what has to change in the environment to then support the teachers who can support the kids so that everyone can be engaged in the task. And they've done major interventions. I mean, they are in the business of trying to help schools identify the extent to which they are providing supportive environments, and they are providing environments to support both the teachers and the students, and they've been able to demonstrate changes in the kids' performance. But I also think we need to get beyond just looking for changes in performance. We need to be thinking about, are these changing attitudes? Are these changing fundamental beliefs? Are they changing commitment to social justice? I mean, there are all kinds of things the schools are supposed to do. So I think we need to be looking more at, not only do those interventions change kids' self-concepts and performance, but do they change the fundamental way the kids are in fact interacting with their world as they move into adulthood. So I would just take it, one step farther and say we've got to, and there are people doing it.
Well, yeah. I was chairman of the board of IRRE for quite a number of years, so was very involved in that. And the most recent thing is that we actually did an intervention. Now, it was within the context of the overall process. The intervention, though, was focused mostly on training teachers. And by training teachers, we actually found that the state tests, which I hate, mandated by the federal government, which I hate seeing do it, but we actually got improvements in the math scores on those tests. So I think the work that Jim has done is really fine work.
I'm going to add one more point, and then I'm going to let Tim say something about this. So the other thing that, in my experience of learning this, so Carol Midgley and Marty Mayer tried to intervene at the school level and tried to change the way they gave grades, so they actually ended up trying to create a mastery-oriented culture within the school. And my memory of that is it was damn hard. And that you had to be very careful how you did it, and it took at least 3 years before they saw enough evidence that it was beginning to have an effect. And so therefore you don't want to evaluate it too soon, because you'll end up proving that you didn't do anything. And these are very fragile interventions. So I absolutely agree we should be doing them, but we shouldn't go in blindly and think it's going to be easy. I mean, psychologists think we'll just go in and do something easy. It's hard to change those environments, and it's hard to make it stick once you have to leave.
I would just add, I think the mantra of Carol and Marty was, fix the environment, don't fix the kid, which was great. It was very exciting. When you fix the environment, there's more than one environment to fix, and a lot of times they disagree with each other. So we got a little bit of traction in the school over 3 years. Stuff continued after the project left. But there was so much stuff that was going on at the district level that was affecting what was happening at the school, and there's so much stuff going on at the testing level that's affecting what's happening in the school. I think it's that's the part that drives people back into the lab, because it's tiring and it's hard to publish, and it's frustrating. I've been involved with this project in Massachusetts where they're really trying to say, let's reshape the environment so that we can focus on what the definition of success is. And the definition of success is moving towards a vocational education creeping earlier and earlier so that there's relevance in the instruction. So, be careful what you wish for in a sense, because people don't always have shared views about what the environment should look like when you talk about changing the environment.
And
I wanted to.
Wow,
I
I was
just make sure that.
Can I just want to answer her actual question about understanding the perceptions of the context and how people work together. So I think that it's easy for us to think, oh, let's take our constructs around individual self-determination and motivation, and we should extrapolate that up to perceptions of the context and how students perceive that and teachers. But I want to say, let's be open to the fact that the constructs, what they are and what they look like, aren't simply just aggregates of individual level perceptions and measures. And so I see that happen a lot, and I want to challenge us to think differently about what growth mindset supported behaviors in teachers might look like, and how that's different than a self-report of a growth mindset, or achievement goal, individual achievement goals, and what those supportive environments might look like.
Let me just add what Chris said. There's an increasing literature on collective efficacy, and the literature, as I say, more and more looking at it. One of the findings that come out is what people have just emphasized, and that is you have to have a supportive environment, because it doesn't really do any good to build groups a sense of efficacy, and then if they can't do anything, they feel just bound in.
So the way this was organized, I wish we had another hour, but several students had written in questions, and Allison had also indicated that each presenter would have 1 minute to answer one final question, which is, what is one question that you would like to see the next generation of researchers answer with regard to motivation? So one question. So be thinking about that, because you only have 1 minute. But at least one question from this long list of those of you, the students, sent it in, if anybody, one person, and try to be very specific. What role should motivational research play in contemporary and future educational policy development? I don't want you to answer this question generally. Tell me about a particular policy that you think motivation research should play a role in, while you're thinking about your answer to the final question. Anybody want to take that one on? Motivation research and policy?
Get rid of standardized tests.
Got the goods to convince the policymakers to get rid of standardized stuff?
No, but we've got the goods, but they won't do it.
Yeah. Anybody else?
I think given the influx of immigrants and refugee students, where this is really changing this is really a big change in education, and I think motivation research has a lot to say about that, and I think that's something that we should look at and say, you can't just blindly apply motivational principles to different student populations. You really have to look at the background and the culture or cultural experiences and like before you can do that. I think that's an area that we can make a difference.
Yeah, I agree. Got to do the research first. Got to have the goods to be able to have that conversation. Okay. Here's your last question. You each have 1 minute, Allison, because we want to make sure you're out of here. What is the one question that you would like to see the next generation of researchers answer with regard to motivation? One question. You just start here, Chris?
Start
Your answer to what one question would you like to see the next generation answer with regard to motivation?
How to integrate our individual theories of motivation with making changes in the context.
All right, you guys, that's your challenge.
I think the one question that I'd be most interested in is how do our different motivational theories play out among different students in the same environment?
The question I'd like to see answered is how can we get a better understanding of how motivation actually operates in a given environment, how it changes and develops as a result of different kind of contextual or cultural influences and instructional conditioning.
Well, when I gave teaching motivation courses, and they said, well, your exams get out, don't you have to change the questions? I said, no, just change the answers. I never had to change exams. I think what I would ask is not what questions, but what new set of constructs. Get rid of us. We're on the stage here. You know, time for new directions, new constructs, new theories. That will then lead you to new sets of answers and new sets of questions. I think motivation to me has been a little too static the last couple decades. So time for new answers, types of answers to the same questions.
How to figure out how to be need supportive for educational administrators so that the educational administrators will be more need supportive of the teachers. And hey, you know, the teachers are working really hard and they need support that they're not getting, thanks in part to Washington and other kinds of processes, so that the teachers in turn will be more need supportive of the students in their classes.
I'm going to answer them differently because I would agree with all of them, so those are all good questions. But I want to reinforce, I think, what Bernie said. We need to get out of the cognitive focus and get more into affect, get more into emotions. I think we've got to understand things as they are playing out on the ground in life. I mean, we've got to look at motivation as it's playing out in the task, and we've got techniques to do that now. And we've got to integrate in our cognitive variables into the rest of what's going on in the social culture and in the individual while they're engaged in these tasks. So we also need to be thinking at the group level. I was talking to someone yesterday, and when we talk about classroom climate, I'm not sure there's such a thing as classroom climate, but there probably are things that operate at a level outside of the individual. And we need to come up with better constructs for what is that thing, and then how do we think about what would be the consequence of that at that level. So not raising individual kids, this goes to the collective efficacy idea, or other ways of thinking about how do we conceptualize a motivated environment, and how do we measure it, and what would we look for in that environment, rather than looking at individuals' self-perceptions.
Okay, we made it exactly on time. And, thank all of you for coming, and those of you who stood up.
was a lot of heat. No, you're fine.
You did good.
Oh.
You did really good.
If there's one thing I've always been good at, it's listening to people.
Oh, yeah.
No, being still is hard for me.
Well,
Thank you,
did
though.
being still, yeah.
Well, no, I totally get and respect what you were doing.
And we're still recording, so we just recorded our conversation.
Would this on the website?
I have no idea.
Oh.